I remember it as if it were yesterday. With our parents absent, it was just me and my twin brother Lucas in the house. But in a single moment, he did something so unexpected, so electrifying, that it changed everything. And it's a memory I'll never forget because it was so thrilling. It began like any other night, one of those that settles into a tacit rhythm when you've spent your whole life sharing a space with someone. Our parents had gone out for the evening, leaving the house unusually quiet, interrupted only by the occasional hum of the refrigerator or the creak of the old wood beneath our feet. Yet it wasn't the first time Lucas and I were left to our own devices. We had grown accustomed to it, transforming those nights into our own little world, where time seemed to stretch out, daring us to fill it. I was a few minutes older than Lucas, and despite our different genders, we were identical twins. I was on the couch, idly scrolling through my phone, but my attention wasn't focused on the glowing screen in my hand. On the other side, Lucas was sprawled out in his usual spot, one arm draped over the backrest. His eyes flickered between the TV, and some thought that distracted his concentration. His presence was as familiar to me as the air I breathed, and yet, that night, something in him felt different. I couldn't pinpoint it exactly, but the change was there. In the way his gaze lingered a second too long, or in the tone of his voice that was hard to decipher. "Shall we watch a movie?" Lucas suddenly asked, his voice breaking the soft murmur of the television. He turned his head toward me, and for a moment, his dark eyes met mine in a way that made me forget to answer. Shrugging, I tried to play it cool. "Whatever you want, little bro." With a mischievous smile, he grabbed the remote, scrolling through the options with a deliberate slowness that was clearly meant to test my patience. I couldn't help but smile at his antics. "If you're going to take that long, I choose a romantic comedy," I replied. "No way, not in a million years," he shot back, laughing. It was so easy with Lucas, with our banter and the way we moved through each other's lives like two sides of the same coin. But even though laughter filled the room, there was an underlying current of something else, subtle yet undeniable. Finally, he settled on a movie we had both seen a dozen times, the kind that doesn't require full attention because the dialogue is already etched in your memory. We nestled into the quiet comfort of the night, the glow of the screen casting soft shadows against the walls. However, my attention wasn't really on the movie. My mind was somewhere else, drawn to him in a way that felt both familiar and unsettling. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him looking at me. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but it sent a ripple of awareness through me. Lucas had always been bold, the one who spoke his mind without hesitation, but that night there was a hesitation in him that mirrored my own, in the way he shifted his weight or how his hand moved absent-mindedly along the edge of the couch, as if testing the air between us. "What are you thinking?" I finally asked, unable to stand the silence any longer. He shook his head, offering a slight smile. "Nothing, or well, something," he admitted, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. The light from the screen played across his face, highlighting the sharp angles that were reflected in mine. "Have you ever thought about how strange it is to be twins? I mean, it's weird, isn't it?" I asked cautiously but curiously. "People assume we're the same, right? Sure, I'm a boy and you're a girl, but the same face, the same thoughts, the same everything. But we're not, are we?" I nodded, though his words stirred something within me. Lucas and I had always been seen as a unit, interchangeable in the eyes of most people, but he was right. We weren't the same. Lucas was the daring one, the one who charged headfirst into life, while I preferred to hang back, content to observe. Yet in moments like this, when his guard was down, I saw in him parts that felt very much like my own, a quiet vulnerability he rarely allowed anyone else to see. "I guess it's just easier for people to lump us together," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "It's not like we've ever really shown them otherwise," he replied, his gaze fixed on mine, and I felt the weight of his words between us. "Maybe we should." It was such a simple statement, but the way he said it made my heart race. Before I could respond, he leaned back again, his relaxed posture betraying none of the tension I felt in the air. I turned my attention back to the screen, pretending to watch the movie, but my mind was racing, caught between the familiarity of the moment and that unfamiliar pull that seemed to draw us closer. The minutes passed, and the silence between us grew denser, laden with unspoken words. I didn't know what to say, not even if there was something to say. But Lucas, as always, found a way to break the silence. "You're quiet tonight," he commented, his voice softer, almost tentative. What's going on in that overthinking head of yours? Nothing, I lied, because the truth was tangled in a web of emotions I wasn't ready to unravel, just tired. He didn't press further, but his eyes searched mine as if they could decipher the thoughts I was trying to bury. For a moment, I thought he was going to call me out on it, but instead he leaned closer, his knee deliberately brushing against mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, and I struggled to keep my composure. Sure, it's nothing, he said, his tone lighter now, teasing, but there was an edge to it, a challenge that made my pulse quicken. I forced a smile, shrugging. Yeah, sure. The tension between us was almost palpable now, a silent current that neither of us seemed willing to name. But it was there, undeniable, in the way his gaze lingered a second too long or how the air between us felt charged with something neither of us could ignore. As the night wore on, the distance between us seemed to shrink. Lucas's easy laughter filled the room, pulling me back into the comfort of the moment. But beneath it all, that unspoken tension remained, waiting. And in the quiet, I realized something. This wasn't just another night. Something was shifting between us, and there was no going back. Lucas had always been the louder one, the one who could fill any silence with a joke or a story. But tonight, his usual bravado was muted, replaced by something I couldn't quite name. I felt it every time our knees brushed or when his gaze held mine a moment too long. It wasn't the kind of tension that felt uncomfortable. It was something else, something that sent a thrill through me that I didn't want to admit. Do you ever think about what it would be like if we weren't twins? He asked suddenly, pulling me from my thoughts. I blinked, surprised by the question. What do you mean? He shrugged, leaning back against the couch. I don't know. Just that if we weren't, maybe things would feel different. It was a strange thing to say, and yet it hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. I wanted to ask him what he meant, but something in his tone made me hesitate, like he wasn't even sure of the answer himself. I guess it's hard to imagine, I said finally. We've always been... Yeah, he murmured, his eyes flicking to mine for a brief second before darting away. Always. The word carried a weight I couldn't quite unpack. But before I could dwell on it, he pushed himself off the couch. You want a drink? I'm grabbing something. Sure, I said, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. I watched him disappear into the kitchen, my thoughts spinning as I tried to make sense of this strange shift between us. Lucas had always been my other half, the person who knew me better than anyone. But tonight, it felt like we were standing on the edge of something new, something neither of us could fully grasp. When he came back, he handed me a glass of water, his fingers brushing against mine for just a second too long. He sat closer this time, his thigh pressing against mine as he settled back into the couch. It was such a small thing, but it made my heart race in a way I couldn't ignore. Do you ever wonder why we never talk about real stuff? He asked, his voice low and thoughtful. I frowned. What do you mean? We're close, right? Closer than most people. But there's still stuff we don't talk about. Everybody has things they don't talk about, I said, though the words felt hollow as they left my mouth. He turned to me, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that made me feel exposed. But we're not everybody, Ethan. We're us. The word struck something deep inside me, and I felt my breath catch. He wasn't wrong. We weren't like most people. We had always been closer, understood each other in ways no one else could. But there were still things we avoided, things we didn't dare put into words. I guess. I trailed off, unsure of how to finish the sentence. I guess, he repeated, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. That's your answer? I rolled my eyes, trying to deflect. What do you want me to say? Something real, he said simply, his voice softer now. I didn't know how to respond to that. The weight of his gaze was too much, so I turned away, staring at the TV even though I wasn't paying attention to it. Lucas didn't press me, but he didn't move away either. The warmth of his leg against mine was a constant reminder of how close he was, how impossible it was to ignore the strange pull between us. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, until he broke it again. Do you ever think about us differently? My heart skipped a beat at his words, and I turned to look at him, searching his face for some hint of what he meant. But his expression was unreadable. His eyes locked on mine as if daring me to answer. I don't know what you mean, I said, though my voice wavered slightly. Yeah, you do, he said, his tone quiet but firm. I think you've thought about it, even if you don't want to admit it. The air between us felt electric, charged with something that had been building for years, but was only now coming to the surface. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to brush off his words and pretend they didn't mean anything. But I couldn't. Not when every glance, every touch, every unspoken word between us told a different story. What if I have? I finally asked, my voice barely a whisper. His eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, he looked as uncertain as I felt. But then his expression softened, and he leaned in just enough that I could feel his breath against my skin. Then maybe I'm not the only one. The words hung in the air between us, and a rush of emotions, fear, excitement, confusion, tangled together in a way that left me breathless. Lucas didn't move, didn't push, but the intensity of his gaze told me he was waiting, giving me the space to decide. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what this meant, didn't know what it would change. But in that moment, with Lucas so close, with the weight of his words pressing down on me, I realized I didn't care. Lucas remained still, his eyes locked onto mine, unwavering. His expression was unreadable, yet filled with something I couldn't look away from. Every fiber of my being told me to say something, to do something. But I was frozen, caught between fear and an undeniable pull toward him. "Ethan," he said softly, my name slipping from his lips like it was meant just for me. "You can talk to me. You always could." It wasn't just the words themselves, but the way he said them, quiet and gentle, stripped of all his usual bravado. Lucas wasn't teasing or testing me anymore. He was being raw, vulnerable in a way that sent a tremor through me. "I know," I murmured, though my voice felt foreign in my own ears. "It's just complicated." "Complicated doesn't mean bad," he said, leaning back slightly, though the space between us still felt charged. "Sometimes it just means it's worth figuring out." The way he looked at me then, steady, unflinching, made my heart race. It wasn't just the intensity of his gaze, but the depth of it, like he saw through every wall I'd ever put up. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to hide. I knew something was coming, and I was right. Without fully realizing it, I'd leaned closer to him, our knees brushing again, but this time with purpose. Lucas didn't flinch or move away. Instead, he tilted his head just slightly, his eyes searching mine for any hint of hesitation. "What are we doing, Lucas?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," he admitted, his lips twitching into the faintest of smiles. "But it doesn't feel wrong, does it?" I wanted to say yes, to insist that this was a mistake, that we'd wake up in the morning and pretend this never happened. But the truth lodged itself in my throat, refusing to be ignored. Didn't feel wrong. If anything, it felt like something that had been building for years, waiting for this moment to break free. "No," I finally said, the word falling from my lips like a confession. And that was all it took. Lucas moved first, closing the space between us until I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. My heart pounded in my chest, my thoughts a tangled mess of anticipation and fear. But when his lips met mine, the noise in my head disappeared, leaving only the sensation of him. The kiss was slow at first, tentative, as if we were testing the waters of something neither of us fully understood. His hand found its way to my jaw, his fingers brushing against my skin in a way that sent shivers down my spine. I didn't think I couldn't. I just kissed him back, letting myself get lost in the moment. It didn't feel strange or awkward, not like I had feared it might. If anything, it felt natural, like this was where we were always meant to end up. Lucas's touch grew bolder, his lips pressing harder against mine as his other hand slipped to the back of my neck, pulling me closer. I let out a soft, involuntary sigh, and he smiled against my lips, his confidence strengthened by my reaction. When we finally pulled apart, my chest rose and fell with shallow breaths, my mind still reeling. Lucas didn't move far. His forehead rested lightly against mine, his fingers still tangled in my hair. His eyes searched mine, a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low but steady. I nodded, though the reality of what had just happened was only beginning to sink in. "Yeah, I think so." He chuckled softly, his thumb brushing along my jaw. "You think?" "I don't know what to think," I admitted, my voice trembling slightly. "But I don't regret it." "Good," he said simply, his smile widening into something more genuine. "Because I don't either." The weight of his words settled over me, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. This was Lucas, my brother, my other half. And yet, in this moment he felt like something more. Someone I had been drawn to without even realizing it. We didn't say much after that. The silence between us was no longer heavy with tension but filled with a quiet understanding. But we both knew this wasn't over. Something was still coming. Lucas's arm slipped around my shoulders, pulling me against him as we sank back into the couch. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. And for the first time in what felt like forever, everything felt right. "Do you think this changes everything?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Lucas tilted his head, his gaze meeting mine with a depth that made my chest tighten. "Does it have to?" I hesitated, his question ricocheting in my mind. "I don't know. Maybe it already has." He nodded slowly, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns along my arm. The touch was soothing, a quiet reassurance in the face of the unknown. "Maybe that's not a bad thing," he said after a pause, his voice laced with tentative hope. I hadn't expected that. It was such a simple statement, yet it carried the weight of everything we weren't saying aloud. The truth was, I didn't know what this meant for us. I didn't know if we could keep this thing, whatever it was, contained within the walls of our home. But Lucas's confidence, his quiet certainty, steadied me in a way I couldn't explain. "What happens when someone finds out?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it. He frowned, his fingers stilling against my skin. "No one has to know, Ethan. This is ours. No one else gets a say in it." His words stirred something deep inside me, a mix of relief and fear. I wanted to believe him, to trust that we could keep this moment untouched by the outside world. But doubt lingered, a shadow at the edge of my thoughts. Lucas must have sensed my hesitation because he shifted slightly, his hand moving to cup my cheek. "Hey," he said softly, his thumb brushing against my skin. "We don't have to figure it all out right now. One step at a time, okay?" I nodded, his touch grounding me once more. Lucas had always been the one to dive in headfirst, unafraid of what lay ahead. I envied that about him, his ability to embrace the unknown without hesitation. And for the first time I found myself leaning into that part of him, trusting him to guide me through the uncertainty. The sound of the clock ticking in the corner pulled me back to the present, a quiet reminder of the world outside our little bubble. I sat up slightly, glancing toward the window where the night sky stretched endlessly, stars flickering faintly against the darkness. "We should probably head to bed," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "Probably," Lucas agreed, though he made no move to let me go. Instead, his hand lingered on my arm, his touch anchoring me to the moment. Reluctantly, we untangled ourselves from the couch, the warmth of his body leaving a faint ache in its absence. The house was eerily quiet as we made our way upstairs, the faint creak of the wooden stairs the only sound breaking the stillness. Lucas walked just ahead of me, his presence a steady reassurance in the dark. When we reached my bedroom door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Lucas stopped just behind me, his closeness a tangible presence that made me shiver. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice soft but firm. I nodded, though the knot in my chest told a different story. "Yeah, it's just, I don't want this to end." His hand found mine, his grip firm yet gentle. "It doesn't have to." The weight of his words settled over me, a silent promise that eased the tension in my chest. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, with Lucas following closely behind. The room felt smaller with him there, the air charged with an unspoken energy that made my skin prickle. He didn't ask for permission as he pulled back the covers and settled onto my bed, his movements as natural as if this had always been our routine. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, but seeing him there, calm, unbothered, silenced them all. "Come on," he said, patting the empty space beside him. "It's just me." His words carried a weight that made my throat tighten. It wasn't just anything. It was him. Lucas. My other half, the one person who knew me better than I knew myself. And yet, in that moment he felt like something more. Like someone I was seeing for the first time. I slipped under the covers beside him, the mattress dipping slightly under our combined weight. Lucas turned onto his side, propping himself up on one elbow as his gaze met mine. The faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains cast soft shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles that mirrored my own. "You're overthinking again," he said, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Can you blame me?" I whispered. "No," he admitted, his expression softening. "But you don't have to. Not tonight." His hand moved to my face, his fingers brushing against my jaw in a touch so gentle it made my chest ache. I didn't flinch or pull away. Instead, I let myself lean into his touch, my eyes slipping closed as the weight of the moment washed over me. When his lips met mine, it wasn't tentative like before. It was deliberate, full of a quiet intensity that stole the breath from my lungs. His hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me closer as his body pressed against mine, his warmth seeping into me like a second skin. I didn't think about what this meant or what would come next. I couldn't. All I could do was feel. The shadows crossed his face, highlighting the sharp angles that mirrored my own. "You're overthinking again," he said, a small smile appearing at the corner of his lips. "Can you blame me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "No," he admitted, his expression softening. "But you don't have to. Not tonight." His hand moved toward my face, his fingers grazing my jaw with a touch so delicate it made my chest ache. I didn't pull away or step back. Instead, I allowed myself to lean into his touch, closing my eyes as the weight of the moment settled over me. When his lips met mine, it wasn't tentative like before. It was deliberate, filled with a silent intensity that stole my breath. His hand slid to the back of my neck, pulling me even closer as his body pressed against mine, his warmth seeping into my skin like a second layer. I didn't think about what this meant or what would come next. I couldn't. I could only feel. His features, so familiar and yet so different in this context, made my heart clench. This was Lucas. Not just my twin brother, but someone I had seen in every light, from every angle. And now someone who was something more. I stayed still, watching him breathe, my mind a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't name. A part of me wanted to get out of bed, to put distance between us before the weight of the day settled in. But another part, the stronger part, couldn't bear to move. His presence was an anchor, grounding me in a way I didn't understand but desperately craved. As if sensing my thoughts, Lucas stirred, his eyes fluttering open before meeting mine with a softness that made my chest tighten. He didn't speak right away, just held my gaze, the silence between us heavy with everything we weren't saying. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of us moved. The weight of last night lingered between us, heavy but not uncomfortable. Lucas' hand slid up to my face, his thumb brushing my cheek with a tenderness that made me hold my breath. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I nodded, though the knot in my chest hadn't fully unraveled. "Yeah, just trying to understand what this means." His lips curled into a faint smile. "It means we stop pretending." The simplicity of his words caught me off guard. "And then what?" Lucas' expression softened, his fingers stilling against my skin. "Then we figure it out together." His certainty, his quiet confidence, steadied me in a way I hadn't expected. I didn't have all the answers. I wasn't sure I ever would. But Lucas' presence, his unwavering belief that this was okay, was enough to calm the storm in my mind. The day passed slowly, each moment laced with a newfound awareness. We didn't talk about it, at least not explicitly. Instead, we moved through the morning routine with a silent understanding. What had happened wasn't something we needed to analyze. Simply was. It wasn't until the afternoon that the weight of the outside world seeped back in. A message from Mom popped up on my phone, reminding me that they'd be back soon. The bubble we had been living in, that fragile space where time seemed to stand still, was about to burst. "They're coming back in a few hours," I said, breaking the silence. Lucas looked at me, his expression unreadable. "And I don't know," I admitted. "What happens now?" He sat up, setting his coffee cup down on the counter with a calmness that contrasted with the tension I felt. "Nothing has to change, Ethan, unless we want it to." His words landed on me like a silent promise. "And if they find out?" "They won't," he said simply, with unwavering confidence. "This is ours. No one else needs to know." The truth of his words settled me, though a small part of me still shrank under the weight of the secret we now shared. It wasn't shame, not exactly. It was more fear of the unknown, of what it meant to navigate this new territory with only each other to lean on. Hours passed, and soon, The house began filling with the familiar sounds of life returning. Our parents' voices, their laughter, the clatter of suitcases being unpacked. It all felt jarring after the quiet intimacy of the day before. Lucas and I fell effortlessly into our usual roles, the ease of our interactions masking the undercurrent of something new. But as the night stretched on, the weight of everything settled over me again. The secret we shared, the thing we hadn't dared to name, felt immense within the confines of our small home. Later, when the house had fallen silent again, I found Lucas sitting on the couch, his gaze fixed on the dim glow of the TV. He didn't look up as I approached, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened as if bracing for something. "Can't sleep?" I asked, breaking the stillness. "Something like that," he replied, his tone neutral but heavy with unspoken words. I sat beside him, the space between us feeling wider than it had in days. For a long moment, neither of us spoke, the silence stretching until it became almost unbearable. But then Lucas turned to me, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that made my heart beat faster. "Do you regret it?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question caught me off guard, but the answer came without hesitation. "No." "You." His lips curved into a faint smile. "Never." The relief that washed over me was immediate, unraveling the knot that had been tightening in my chest all day. Lucas moved closer, his hand finding mine in a gesture so simple and yet so profound it took my breath away. "This doesn't have to be complicated," he said softly, his fingers squeezing mine. "We just take it one step at a time." I nodded, his words anchoring me in a way nothing else could. For the first time in what felt like forever, the uncertainty didn't feel overwhelming. It felt manageable, like something we could face together. As the night stretched on, the silence between us became comfortable again. Lucas draped an arm over my shoulders, pulling me close. I let myself sink into his warmth, his presence wrapping around me with a sense of security I didn't fully understand but didn't want to let go of. Whatever came next, whatever challenges we faced, I knew one thing for certain. We had each other, and for now that was enough. But still, I'm not sure if this is right. What do you guys think? Was what I did with my twin brother okay? Let me know your thoughts in the comments.